Die Zeit ist, more or less, 10 Uhr und die ist .NET API Review. Yeah, one of these days I should learn how to say more or less. Though it's not very precise, so maybe Germans don't even have a phrase for it. Weird. All right, we have a whole lot of stuff because apparently people aren't busy, so they just make more proposals. Thankfully, none of them are read. But let's just go ahead and get started. We previously talked about add new overloads to read from JSON async in HttpContentJson extensions, issue 72103. And now we have Eric with us, so we have a little bit more data, so we're going to start with a bringback. Eric?
All right. So this issue was reviewed earlier just to kind of freshen your memory. This concerns, I guess, synchronizing the overloads for HttpContentJson extensions to make them match the overloads that exist in, forget the name, HTTP client JSON extensions. And that is specifically to address a UX issue when essentially users need to pass the null JSON serializer options argument, in which case they would need to explicitly name the type. Otherwise, it would fail to resolve to the correct overload, which is a fairly common thing that users would want to do. When you want to serialize using the default settings, you need to pass null explicitly. So this community member is proposing we add the missing overload so that we address the issue. When this was reviewed last time, basically there was some feedback around ensuring that we have the same set of overloads for HTTP client JSON extensions, which in fact it does. So I think we should go ahead and improve this, but there also needs to be another change that Jeremy did point out over email. Basically, I didn't actually write it up in the proposal because it just happened, but essentially we would need to update the overload that does accept JSON serializer options so that it no longer accepts null as the optional parameter. And it no longer is optional, basically.
I think it's all these guys. You think if I was smart, I would just copy my email. And yet, I continue doing this. Yeah, because that would look much better. Because it'll get rid of all the redundant namespacing. Or it won't. Alright, so yeah, if we add these two, then calling read from JSON async with just content is now ambiguous between this defaulted cancellation token and this defaulted serializer options. So we should remove the default of serializer options. And there should be another one here somewhere. This one. Yeah, I actually don't care about that. Okay. Alright. Objections?
Oh, sounds good.
Alright. good enough.
Thank you.
All right, possibly now our most skipped issue, just because of who was and wasn't in meetings. Add snake case support to system text JSON, issue number 782.
Right. So this issue has already been approved before. And the only reason why we're bringing it back for review is that the community member implementing the feature actually wanted to broaden the scope a bit. And basically by adding kebab case support and also adding support for uppercase snake case and uppercase kebab case. So we have a whole new matrix of supported naming policies to be considered.
If I recall correctly, there was something about somebody wanting or wondering why Pascal case wasn't explicitly named in here. That was one of the things when we tried talking about this in your absence.
I think that was me.
Excellent. So Tanner, ask your question.
Yeah, we've got a lot of other cases specified here. Why not Pascal case?
I'm not familiar with the conversations that predate this meeting, but my take is that probably the value of Pascal case is less important given that this is mapping .NET member names to JSON property names, and as such, most properties already use Pascal case.
So unspecified is use whatever the property name is in the .NET, right?
Yeah.
Right, but if, for example, the property name, or if it's applied to a field, the field name started or was camel cased instead of Pascal cased, there's not a easy policy which is basically to upper the first character and move on with life.
Right, like let's say you were using Unity where they default to completely different conventions from the framework design guidelines, and they use camel casing by default. And you wanted it to be Pascal case for consistency purposes, or because you wanted to interop with something which was Pascal case elsewhere, etc.
I think what is implicit with the current camel case naming policy implementation that we're shipping is that it implicitly assumes that the source property name is already in Pascal case. So the question is, if something is targeting Pascal case, what is the source naming convention? Is it snake case? Is it kebab case? Is it preceded with an underscore like we do in runtime, or something different? So it feels like there might not be one correct way to achieve
Right,
this.
but you know, the guidelines for fields that are public, assuming I'm recalling correctly, are that they should be camel cased. So Pascal case on a field would be pretend this was a property. I'm just like, there are cases that you can say the guidelines would suggest that Pascal case would be a valid transform that is not the identity transform.
But for what it's worth, by default, we don't serialize fields. Users need to opt into that, and in that case, we also only serialize public fields. So again, it's kind of a niche use case. You know, the abstraction is there for users to implement whatever naming policy they wish to use. Honestly, I don't see much benefit from a Pascal case naming policy.
Fair enough. Are snake and kebab case names well known enough that we're not being silly here?
Yeah, they are. One thing that might be, like, we might want to spend some time discussing the names of the naming policies that we ship. Like, for example, uppercase snake case is known as screaming snake case. Gonna type that in chat, but I'm wondering whether we want to follow that convention. But to my knowledge, there is no corresponding screaming kebab case. So but we can just go ahead and use the boring variant, basically snake case, uppercase.
Could call it whispering snake case. I'm joking though. I much prefer lower and upper over screaming.
Yeah. Well,
I do like where your head's at, by the way.
there is a third option for snake, which is that you leave all the capital letters alone and just insert underscores every time you transition lower to upper. Not that I'm saying we should do that, but there is a snakeify transform that doesn't change casing.
So snake Pascal and snake camel and snake identity.
Well, yeah. So yeah, snake Pascal, snake lower, snake upper, snake camel, and if I didn't already say just snake, then snake. Let's just say snake like 6 more times, because why not? I'm not saying we should do them, just being, like, calling it snake lowercase is saying we're lowercasing your thing as part of the transform. So I think it's actually reasonable to be more chatty.
For what it's worth, I'm not a big fan of the current naming used in the proposal, but I didn't change it so that we could discuss it here. I probably much prefer if we called it snake case lower rather than snake lowercase, because snake on its own doesn't necessarily immediately suggest that we're using snake case. Or we could be fully verbose and call it snake case lowercase.
I think what you have
I think it would be
here
lowercase
seems reasonable.
snake case, because you have to snake it first. If you lowered it first, you wouldn't know how to snake it. And then English, we put modifiers first.
Yeah, but in .NET though, we tend to group constructs wherever we can.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
we
yeah.
would
Just-
probably want the snakes together.
I just lower snake case lower, not saying case again, I think is obviously this is a suffix variant, but snake case lowercase versus lowercase snake case, to me that implies that the second one was done first, because English. Yeah. I was looking at this and was having the same, like, snake lower feels weird, but snake case lower sounds maybe a little better to me. Lower snake case also works, but then that tears the snakes apart, which some people like doing, I guess. Tearing apart a kebab is certainly great. That's how you eat it. So yeah, does anybody not like flipping case to be an infix in all of these?
I think that's we just added a bunch of methods to char, like char.is ASCII digit and char.is hex digit, and for all those we put the lower upper at the end, right?
That sounds right. Sounds familiar.
Kind of have precedent for that.
Okay. Have the fun dead air problem, so move over here. I don't remember how to do this, so no, don't actually delete all of them. I'll just do them one at a time.
Yeah, case as an infix works. Just like Steve said, we did it with ASCII on char. As long as snake and kebab are kind of clustered at the front, I'm happy.
I mean, one possible alternative, given that snake case generally implies lowercase, maybe we could just call that snake case, and the other one we could just call it, snake case capitalized or snake case uppercase.
Like I said, we could end up with somebody coming in and justifying to us why we want snaked case preserving, and having lower on there just makes it clear. There's a choice. This is the transform we're doing. Don't be surprised that all your capital letters went away.
Also easier to implement.
And yeah. All right. Hearing no objections. Boom.
And you have what you believe is a good heuristic for when you should insert the underscore or the hyphen and when you shouldn't. Because I imagine we're not changing that from release to release.
There are still debates to be made about that.
Okay.
Generally, Lyomi is very opinionated on that thing, and there need to be discussions both with him and the community member contributing the implementation.
Okay, sure. Like one interesting thing just to keep in mind, and this is going to have to be documented, like casing is not stable across operating systems, across runtimes, across releases, blah, blah, blah. So if we have something that changes case and it's persisted, aka you have a protocol as we have here, you have potentially interoperability issues. So just document all of that and make sure that it's well understood everywhere.
And presumably we want to pick some casing table and stick with it, invariant, ordinal, whatever, rather than current culture. Or...
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent point.
Of course, Framework Design Guidelines 3rd edition does suggest all public members be named only in English. And never use Unicode characters, even though the C# spec allows it. Just saying. Those are things we added.
Yep.
Not that stops people from not doing it.
Well, I mean, if you're writing your own application,
Whatever.
feel free to violate the guidelines left and right?
Sure. All right.
All right, so this is the first of multiple proposals that are things that a couple of years ago I probably would have poo-pooed, and now I'm a big proponent of. Basically, for a long time, we've had proposals for things that one can implement as a simple loop. And for the most part, we've said, just write the loop. But with all of our focus on vectorization and being able to make things, 8, 16, whatever times faster, the amount of code that one needs to write, or at least the skill set one needs to have to implement such methods, it's no longer just a 3-line loop. It could be 2, 10, 100 times as much code as that. And so we've started floating a bunch of proposals for things, hopefully for 8, where these common loops that you would write that can be vectorized in one way, shape, or form, we'd include those in the box such that developers don't have to be concerned about the efficiency. And with something like this, the proposal here is basically just making it easy to count how many times something occurs in something else. You see this show up, for example, if someone's trying to do an efficient replace operation, they need to know, how big to make the remaining the destination. So they need to count how many times the things occurs and do the math and whatnot. There are a variety of reasons we need to count stuff. We have need for this on our own code base. Other people have need for it. So these APIs are just find our typical pattern of either a span or read-only span as the thing you're searching in, and then looking for either a single thing or a sequence of things, and counting the number of times that occurs. One of the interesting things about this proposal, at least for the one that takes a t value rather than a read-only span value, is the natural thing that you might do if you were trying to vectorize and be fast would be an index of loop like in the API usage, but it can be made to be much faster than that at least in certain cases, if you're not constantly going back to index of to do the vectorized operation. You can very easily just count how many times something occurs in each vector that you read without having to restart the search each time. So we can make at least some of these very fast, and much faster than someone would do if they were trying to do it on their own.
Would we get benefit out of this for pre-specializing types through overloading, like making count of byte different from count of t, or do we think it's good enough to specialize at runtime?
We can specialize it in if type if we needed to, and I don't know that we'll need to, but if we needed to, we would do if type of t equals type of char, and it would be specialized by the JIT, or whatever it was compiled to assembly, it would be taken care of then.
Okay.
Yeah, we have those specializations within index of, but it doesn't affect the API surface.
That's fair. I just know sometimes we have it and sometimes we don't.
The one place that we would probably want specialized API would be if, for example, we wanted to do something that was like if we wanted someone to be able to pass in a string comparison, we would have an overload that took a char value or a read-only span of char or a string or whatever, and a string comparison. In fact, that was part of the original proposal, but Levi suggested we drop it from this.
Yeah, it's the reason I had suggested that is, like, if you do ordinal or ordinal ignore case, things are very easy. If you do anything other than those two, things become extremely complicated very, very quickly. And your algorithmic complexity becomes O of n squared instead of O of n. It's unfortunate. Anyway, all of that said, so you had mentioned replacement as an example here. So does that mean that, for instance, say that I call count, and for span I pass the 3-character string AAA, and for value I pass the 2-character string AA. How many matches are there, 1 or 2?
I was about to ask that same question.
Well, the case for replacement that I was mentioning is usually with symbols, they're non-overlapping, and usually you're searching for one thing and you're replacing it with 3 things or something like that, and so you're not going to have any conflicts between the searches you're performing. If that was an issue, we would need a much more complicated replace.
Right, but like in the let's call it the unrolled version of this doing index of skipping, does it go forward value.length or does it go forward 1?
Value.length.
Okay, so non-overlapping then. Okay, that seems reasonable. It seems like something we have to just choose and then document.
I think we choose that. I mean, at some point for any of these searching operations, you get to the complexity where you need a full regex engine, and then just use regex.
Fair enough. And I assume if value is an empty span, we throw an argument exception or something.
Sorry, what was that, Levi?
If value is an empty span, I assume that's a caller error and we throw an exception.
That's a good question. Yeah, we probably need to special case searching for empty, or we do what regex does, which it forcibly advances for you by 1 if the length was 0.
Sure. And does memory extensions have overloads where you can actually pass in an equality comparer?
It does. Very few of them. In .NET 6, we added an overload of sequence equal that is not constrained to t is I equatable, and that takes an optional I compare of t.
Okay. That all seems reasonable. We could, I guess, would that be a case where right now we still tell people write the loop yourself, and if we decide to add the overload in the future, we just do it?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, the primary benefits, from my perspective, the primary reason that we would consider these APIs now is that it can be made a lot faster in the implementation, and I don't, unless we, if compare equals equality compare of t dot default, and still special case that, there's not really much more we could do in the implementation than someone could do in their own 3-line loop.
That is true, yeah. So similarly, we wouldn't take like a predicate or something like Link does. Okay.
I mean, we can certainly add these if we decide we want to extend it further. Certainly I think there's a much bigger hurdle to adding a brand new named method than there is to adding one more overloaded of an existing method. So if after having 4 of these overloads, we decide, we really want a 5th that takes an iCompare, or a 5th and a 6th, or whatever like that, it seems fine to me. I opened a separate issue about whether we want to just drop the where ti equatable t constraint from a bunch of the memory extensions methods in general, since we can semantically we can do the same thing using just equality compare of t dot default dot equals. Jan made the argument against that we'd probably lose some efficiency for reference types because equality compare of t dot default dot equals wouldn't be as good. So I don't know.
Fair enough. Aside from string, are there default compares for reference types that do anything other than referential equality? Oh, I guess it calls the dot equals method, of course. Right. Yeah. Sure. Okay. I guess my last question here then is, do we still need the overloads for this span of t, or do we have new language features that can kind of force everything to go to this real span of t?
We do not have new language features.
Okay. Okay, that's fine.
I also, that said, at some point, we have this pattern where we're basically doubling our overloads to deal with read-only span and span. We could also decide, if someone needs to use either needs to cast or needs to use the non-extension syntax. I don't have a strong opinion on it.
Oh, no, it's fine. If that's a pattern we're still using, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't change the pattern in the past release.
No.
Okay.
Look good?
Yep. And if you have a string or an array, you call .asSpan, and then all the extension methods become available to you. That seems reasonable.
And that's what we've done. We have a bunch of other things on memory extensions that are the same.
Okay. Excellent.
I can parenthesis.
One last thing to note. Late in .NET 7, we went through and fixed all the nullability of the where t quote I equatable of t question mark. We previously didn't have that question mark anywhere. So we fixed that, but that means that all these new methods coming through have that question mark at the end, which just means that you're allowed to say that t is a nullable type, whereas without the question mark, you get a compiler warning if you don't. If you do that, I mean.
And you said that's within the constraint?
Yeah, that question mark at the very end. With nullable reference types enabled, if you don't have that question mark at the end, you're constraining t to be non-nullable.
Got it, okay.
And this just says, no, it's okay for you to use a nullable one. Our implementations all allowed it. They would check if the value was null, if it was a reference type, before trying to dereference it. but you couldn't actually specify it without getting a compiler warning.
Right, because it would say where t, without the question mark, where t is a non-null I-equatable.
Exactly.
And since I-equatable assume it's an interface, so it assumes reference. So okay, yep. Fair enough. It is a
Love it.
Yeah, I wish it didn't share the question mark because it just makes so much thinking. But that's in the past. Apparently, this was in the open list, so cool. Marshaller type to support safe handle and source-generated marshalling without hard coding in the generator. 74035.
We need Jeremy.
Yeah. I can't Jeremy this enough.
Should we just ping him offline? Does someone want to take that then?
Yeah, somebody please ping him. In the meantime, add a DQ in queue method to the priority queue type 75070. Is this still you, Eric?
I would guess so, yeah.
Okay. Well, I know you added priority queue. I just didn't know if that's still a thing you care about.
Yeah, so this is a community proposal to incorporate an extract and insert operation to the priority queue type. We already shipped with .NET 6 and an insert then extract operation, which is subtly different to this one. Most importantly, this one is not guaranteed to fail, but still users might want to get the minimum element from the top from the bottom of the heap rather before they actually insert the element they have on their hands. This is something that's already shipped in Python, for example, and other heap implementations. I don't see why we wouldn't want to add this one, other than the obvious adding more methods to a generic collection.
So what's the other thing we added?
NQDQ. It has the identical signature, if I recall correctly.
Yep. So NQDQ is add a new thing, but it could already be the highest priority, and then you take it back. And it's guaranteed to not fail because you're always adding something. And DQ NQ is give me the current highest priority thing, throw if it's not there, and then before you give up on messing with the tree, here's a new value.
Yep.
Okay.
And we have legitimate use cases for this?
I mean, I asked the community member to provide a few examples. They weren't too convincing. Like, I would have liked to see certain popular algorithms that really benefit from this. I haven't seen one. I think the fact that Python has it is convincing enough for me.
Python has both NQDQ and DQNQ?
Yeah.
Does it have any other specialized pairings of operations?
I wouldn't think so.
Like NQDQ, or
Cadeditor. Let's just go full Lisp. CADADAR. The first thing of the rest of the first thing of the rest of the list. Yes. Yes. Is there really enough perf of double tapping the heap?
I mean, a heap operation is log_n. Asymptotically, whether you sequence two separate operations or you call this one, the only difference is that you touch the heap twice. So it basically the constant factor theoretically doubles.
But isn't removing the head an O1 operation?
No.
Okay.
No. If you remove the head, then you need to basically sift up an element and reconstitute the heap so that it keeps satisfying the heap property.
Okay. So it's always balanced. Like it's a rebalance, because if you just had a tree, you could unbalance the tree and just not care. But
yeah, basically when you remove the bottom of the heap, then you need to put something else in its stead, but you can't do a random insertion. You have to pick something that is, the smallest thing.
okay.
And that needs, basically starting from the bottom of the heap and moving up until you find that.
Okay. In my head, it was going to be, there are only two choices, but I haven't. Data structures was a long time ago.
I wouldn't have remembered this stuff if I hadn't implemented it again.
Fair enough. Okay, because I can see the other one, which is I may have a new highest priority thing that you should be giving me, and this one just seems like it like try get value on dictionary, except less. So I guess once there's a custom comparer involved, maybe it actually is expensive. No, because that would have been already done on the inside. Whatever. All right. Yeah. I question its value, but if somebody can justify its value at all, I think the proposal's fine.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I did consider this during the initial implementation, but decided not to include it, primarily because I wasn't aware of any super common algorithms that use this. Like the NQ-DQ is actually used by algorithms, for example, in machine learning. So it felt like a nice to have addition.
No, don't attach a file. Never attach a file. Boom. Has Jeremy joined us? No. No. Steve! Memory extensions replace of some stuff. 75322.
So continuing in the same vein as the previous one, basically a very, very simple replace. There are complicated replaces that people can do. You want to replace this sequence with that sequence, but one of the most common is just this single thing with that single thing. And there are a bunch of cases where you want to be able to do a string of this single thing with that single thing. And today you can do that with span, not replace, but every time you do that, you're creating a new string. You can do that in place on a span with this, and just do as many in place replacements as you want. So while there are other variations we could potentially want for this in the future. Sorry, I sound robotic, Emo?
A little bit.
You're still understandable.
I'll try and get a new mic in a second. While there are potentially other replace operations we should do in the future, I think this one is like the 75% case we can just go ahead with now. This one only makes sense on span and not read-only span because we're actually doing mutation.
So 2 questions. One, if we were to add variable with replace, we would clearly need a more complicated signature. So which do you think that we want a different name here, like replace in place, just to make sure that it's distinct from any other complicated things in the future? And then number 2 is, instead of void, would it make sense to and be efficient to also return the count of replacements?
So possible, yes. As efficient, probably not. just as a simple example, and Tanner's on the line, so you can probably comment further, but there are a bunch of our vectorized operations where we will just peel off, 128-bit vector, 128-bit vector, and then we get to the end, and there's like only 64 bits remaining. And rather than processing that sequential, for these idempotent operations, we will just grab the last vector and just do it, process that vector even if it overlaps, because it doesn't matter. Once you start talking about counting, that overlap wouldn't matter. Although I guess
you also couldn't
replace some of them. You wouldn't.
No,
it would matter if you replaced it with itself.
Yeah.
So
yes, which I guess would be idempotent. So why would you do it?
It's worth noting that in the case where we have trailing elements left, and we're concerned about, we have to be concerned about mutation or double counting or anything like that. Typically, you just save the last vector processed as part of the main loop. You process the last vector anyways, and then you mask off the bits that you've already processed, which allows you to basically ignore everything that you've already processed, and then still merge the results back together trivially with a simple conditional select. There's a proposal from Intel, which I've got to finish writing up the actual API proposal for, that we provide some helper methods on vector 128 for effectively getting a leading or trailing mask based on the number of elements that were remaining, which then allow you to trivially do that masking operation.
It would still be more expensive, but potentially not meaningfully, right?
It would be... So in the case where you only have like a single scalar operation left, it would probably be more expensive to continue doing vector masking. As soon as you start getting into 2 or more, and you have to start considering whether you loop unroll or actually have a loop, then the single unchecked vector operation tends to be better.
Yeah, I would probably say like a minority of people would need the count, and hey, we just approved a count method.
Well, that's really that replace clearly has to look at every element. It quote unquote clearly knows how much work it did. That if somebody needs to know what the replacement count is, do they need to call count first, or can replace efficiently understand how much work it has done? And if it can efficiently understand how much work it's done, then it seems like it should just return the count to avoid needing to do a double walk.
Well, so for example, the count method doesn't need to do a not shuffle, but like conditional move or whatever it is. Similarly, the replace method doesn't need to do a move mask and a pop count. So they are actually doing different operations under the covers.
So if the replace is done with some sort of magic SIMD thing that doesn't understand, that can do a conditional override of an element and doesn't understand and return how many it did, then sure, replace doesn't know the count because it's just trusting the processor to do the work for it. But if replace basically has to be implemented as index of adjust move on, then it knows the count, and if there's a difference, it's only in the last couple of elements, and probably avoiding walking through a cache busting couple 100 meg is better to get it done in one call instead of 2.
This won't just be index of adjust position repeat.
Right, but it's the trivial replace understands how much work it did. I don't know what it would end up at of whether or not it would know the count.
I think the short answer is it would be more work for replace to maintain the count to return it. Whether that would be a meaningful additional quantity, I don't know the answer to.
Fair enough.
But it's not like it has the count and then it throws it away.
Right. In SIMD you have to go out of your way to get the count of the number of items that you updated.
Okay.
Like it's not something that is maintained anywhere.
Right. So there is like the replace in this vector x with y is a thing that it does and doesn't know the count.
Yes.
Question mark? Okay.
Right.
In particular, there's no single instruction to do replace like that. You would end up having to do a comparison, which gives you a mask of the matches. You can then use that to effectively and out the bits that you don't want. So you do an and not. That way you clear all the things that had the match, and then you'd or the correct results back in. Now that and not and or can be simplified down to a single instruction with a conditional select. But the actual counting of the number of matches, you end up having to effectively extract the most significant bit and then do a pop count to say how many matches did I actually have in the first place. And then you would just keep that track of that as a separate sum.
Okay.
I think the net result is if you don't care about the count and we produce the count for you, we would be doing measurable wasted work. If we do produce, if we don't produce a count and you have to call count yourself, that would probably be more expensive, again, by some small but measurable amount than if we did it for you. So basically, we're erring on the side of you're not going to need the count. And if you do, it's going to be more expensive than if we did it for you, but
Right. Well,
sorry.
If all memory access was free, then it sounds like replace and count has work cost 3, replace has work cost 2, and count has work cost 2. So doing them both yourself with free memory access is more expensive, and then with memory access not being free on large values, doing twice the work is more than twice as expensive, because you're going to cache fault all over the place. But if the average person doesn't need it, then why are we slowing replace down 50%? Is the question. So.
Yeah, and I would suspect that most inputs to this are relatively small. We're probably talking like, URIs, things like that. Maybe 100 characters in the highest case. I mean, obviously it could go arbitrarily large. I just don't expect it.
Right,
It's
but this
also
is
worth noting
you know,
that string, for example, does not return the count of things it's replaced.
Right.
but it returns a different string.
Well, or the same one, yeah.
So I'm just pointing like that replace already had a return.
Yes.
Right now we have void, and I'm.
There are other ways you can return things. I think Tanner's point is it doesn't have an out int replace count.
Fair enough, but again, it's anytime something's doing work and is void, my brain's like, we have a free register here from calling conventions. Should we be using it?
So potentially silly question, Tanner. Is there ever a scenario in which you have a span of, say, floating point numbers, and you want to replace nans with not nan?
Sure. There's cases for doing any kind of replacement for floating point, whether you're trying to do something like you have sparse data and you want to default nan to another value, or you're making it dense. For example, you're going from sparse to dense, so you want to fill it in with some non-nan value, etc.
So if I guess what I'm getting at is like, is there a situation where we would reasonably expect people to pass nan for old value in this API, and would the API behave correctly in that case?
Replace would have to do an IEEE. We would have to assume that replace follows IEquatable.equals in all cases. In the case of primitives, we can assume that implementation, including for floats, to be IEEE compliant, with the minor adjustments required for .NET, which means nan equals nan, and we can accelerate that if desired.
Okay, so it sounds like it would work, whether it's vectorized as kind of an implementation detail, but it would work such that nan equals nan.
Right.
Okay, and I guess since we just approved count, I guess we would want the same behavior there too, correct?
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Now, if someone wanted to exactly bitwise match a particular nan with payload, That's not something we support without you providing a custom IEquatable. Luckily, we just approved total order IEEE 754 in system numerics, and so they can pass in their own thing there if they wanted.
Okay.
Or I guess actually they couldn't here. They'd have to create a wrapper type. We would have to expose an overload that takes a T comparer.
But
Well, I
that's
mean,
the
if
same-
you
that's the
just
same
cast it
for-
long.
I mean, that's the same issue for all of our index of count. Like we basically don't take a compare anywhere except for sequence equal right now.
Yeah.
Right. And you couldn't cast it to long because that's not the same behavior.
No, I meant if you have a span of double, you could reinterpret cast it as span of long if you want bitwise equality, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you wanted exactly bitwise equality, you could do that.
Today, none of our, or very few of our vectorized operations are actually vectorized for floats, right? Because we do is bitwise equatable, and that would return false for float or double.
Right, but we could and probably should accelerate them with an algorithm that takes into account IEEE.
Right. So
I mean, we can talk with the MLNet team because I'm sure they would be the bigger customer for it.
So the other asked question that wasn't answered was, should we call it something like replace in place?
So how many APIs do we have right now on memory extensions that actually mutate the first parameter? There's sort, and is that it? I think that's it. Oh, reverse, which is sure. And those don't have in place.
No, but Steve's intro made it sound like we may also find it valuable to add, replace in a span a read-only sequence of old value with read-only sequence of new value where they don't have to be the same length. And at that point, the world gets more complicated, and it's if this one overload kind of is structurally different than the rest, that's the question I'm asking. Like everything else has an out or so returns or whatever, and this one doesn't.
To be clear, I wasn't saying we should add this. I was saying this isn't the end-all, be-all of replace methods. There are other variations, but they are much more complicated to think about, whereas this one is straightforward.
Yeah, I would expect that a more complex replace method would actually maybe even have an operation status signature.
Which is fine, but that's if we get 6 overloads of replace and 5 of them have return values and this one is void, is that confusing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's a good question, but I don't think it's confusing though.
Okay.
We also have some other APIs. Levi opened an issue a year or two ago. I opened what I didn't realize was an exact duplicate of his, and then I closed mine in favor of his. But for doing more either in-place mutation or other memory extension things that mutate one of their inputs, if not the only input, for doing things like and or XOR not, etc. And we might decide those belong on memory extensions. We might decide those belong somewhere else. I'm not sure we want to get in the habit of calling all of those in place.
That's fair. I mean, I guess, if we come up with that we want to put replace on, or a more complicated replace that's operation status or whatever, we could always call that one replace into or something to be like, this one's different. You have to give me a source and a destination. I'm different. Or overload it, but yeah, I was just making sure we weren't burning ourselves with a name now that we would regret later.
We also have we have this exact same pattern in other places. Like encoding has get bytes that one of the overloads returns the byte array, and the other overload takes the 2 spans.
Right. Again, this is to me the only weirdness in this one is that this is void. It's
Right.
if it was returning the count, then the replace that that is more complicated is like, well, we needed the return value for something else. But it's once this one goes to void, it feels very different than any other kind of replace we'd be talking about. And
I guess I don't understand. It's not like there's only one way to return something. It's not like we're
no, but like
returned the only one possible. Therefore, we can't possibly give you anything else.
but in encoding get bytes, we have encoding get bytes that returns the byte array, and that's the basis of where we started, more or less. And then you have all the various overloads that, if we'd had span the whole time, would only be the one span version. And that's, well, one of them gives you the answer, and the other one writes the answer somewhere and tells you how much work it did. And this one is like, stuff happens, and you're like, well, what kind of stuff? It's like, don't worry about
Well,
it.
so string builder.replace effectively returns void because it's as with every API in string builder, it returns this for whatever reason. So if you look at that as precedent, it's not actually returning anything useful. So I don't feel bad about this returning void either, if you consider it as part of a builder pattern.
I mean, yeah, like it's just all about, you see something in a code review calling replace, and it's like, well, why are you ignoring the result? It's operation status. It's like, no, this one's void. It's like weird. So, but if it's not specific to replace, it's just me thinking ahead to. Did I drop?
No, you're still there.
Okay. I heard a noise from Teams, which didn't sound like a happy noise. I
mean, I don't think we should change the name to in place just for that reason. A reasonable nod to your concerns, and to be clear, I'm happy with void. But if whoever picks this up to implement it, wants to see what the overhead is of doing the count, like, it's worth an experiment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could even consider, if the runtime is smart enough to see that it returns an int, but you're not actually using it, maybe we don't compute the count. Like, I don't know how hard that would be, but whatever.
That seems difficult. we have the opposite right now. We have is known constant for an argument that requires the method be inline and whatnot.
Yeah.
This would be like, is return value used?
Yeah, and then you have the interesting, like, well, I captured the return value and now it runs 50% slower. It's like, that's a very, very expensive equals that you wrote right there.
I'm happy with this signature, but I do agree though that it means maybe we need to give a little more thought to any future overloads we add. But I still think future overloads will have such a radically different shape that there will be no confusion between them and this.
That's fair. Yeah, I didn't have a very specific thing. It's just more of a, like, hearing of a complicated thing and this thing and looking together and trying to visualize what it might look like in a code review and wondering where confusion would come in. So, if y'all are happy, I'm happy.
Like, existentially happy or happy with this API, or?
I mean, it was...
You have a dog. You're existentially happy by design.
It was Puzzle Hunt over the weekend. I'm happy for at least another 2 or 3 days.
I do think as an experiment, it would be interesting to understand what adding the count costs. If it costs an extra 1%, probably worthwhile to include it. If it costs an extra 20%, probably not. And just as I pulled those numbers out of wherever, but there are a bunch of places that we and others I've seen, grep.app would use this function or could use this function. I can't think of any that cared about the count.
Yeah, I mean, it's niche, but something like Excel with convert the way that they do single text into multiple columns. Like if they were doing something like find tabs and replace them with the null character, and that mapped in their memory to what they were doing, but they needed to know how many columns it mapped to. Like it's sometimes you might need the count. And especially because we talked about count followed by replace, it's like, well, do we need to do them serially, or can we even better vectorize of I already knew the answer, so why am I doing the work again? So, I don't know of a specific place that needs it. It's just it was the obvious. The question felt like the obvious question to me. So
If people do have a need for it, then we can always expose something like replace and get count in the future.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that was
Or an overload that takes an out int or whatever.
Yeah.
All right, and Jeremy K says he's in YouTube, so let's see if we can talk about this without him talking. So, marshaller type to support safe handle and source generated marshalling without hard coding in the generator, 74035. So we have, I don't know, a marshaller. It seems like it's the marshaller pattern using safe handle and presumably
I'm not
just
clear.
has
Is this something that
specialization.
someone explicitly uses, or this is just something the code generator will emit code to use, but no one actually types?
Yeah. Can somebody send Jeremy K a Teams invitation? It's not on his calendar since the series ended, so he has nothing to join.
Okay, there we go.
Yay!
Welcome.
This is much better.
Yes. Doesn't put me on or in the spotlight.
Okay, so the safe handle marshaller is going to just be used by the source generated interop. It is very unlikely people will code directly against this. It matches the model of the source generator shapes that we introduced in .NET 7. And it uses the guaranteed unmarshalling to match the existing patterns of when safe handles are, like when values from safe handles are captured and converted back to managed code in specific handling for exceptions to match the existing behavior. And then for the managed unmanaged ref and managed unmanaged out, we use the onInvoked method in combination with the free to implement a suggestion from Stephen Tobe to more deterministically release safe handles in the presence of a failed invocation where we're not actually going to use them. Because for safe handles we have to pre-allocate, which is why we have the parameterless public constructors on the structs.
Does this issue somewhere have an example of what the source generated code looks like before and after use of this?
It does not.
Because in my mind, I'm trying to understand how it would actually simplify it.
I mean,
So-
my guess would be, if nothing else, because we've taken all of the... No, because all the structure of safe handle is just going to be the structure of calling this, and it would be a line-for-line replacement, wouldn't it?
That's what I'm trying to understand.
So it would be close to a line-for-line replacement, but in the generator, we'd only have to say, use the safe handle marshaller, and all of the other support is already implemented, already tested, and it all falls out. So we don't have any additional logic to support marshalling safe handles. Whereas right now we specifically have to identify, this is the safe handle, this is how we want to marshal it, and then omit the specific code for marshalling a safe handle. So
this
there's
is
more
really
logic
about
in the
simplifying
generator.
the generator rather than simplifying the generated code.
Yes, it's the main goal is to simplify the generator. And this helps if someone, for example, wants to add support for marshaling a null safe handle as int pointer 0 or as just a null pointer, which we cannot support generically because the definition of what is an invalid safe handle, that value is not defined on safe handle, and it's not guaranteed that 0 is always an invalid value or that 0 is the only invalid value. For example, safe handle invalid 0 or safe handle 0 or -1 is invalid is a abstract class type that we have, because for a lot of handles 0 or -1 is invalid. So what do you marshal a null safe handle to? Do you want to do 0? Do you want to do -1? We don't know. So by moving out the code into a type, if users want to write their own safe handle marshalers that handle the null case in their particular way, it's much easier for them to go in and take our code and modify it to their use case, as compared to having to look into the generator, figure out how the generator does it, and then turn it into a marshaler themselves to then modify to their use case.
I didn't quite follow that. Are you saying that that someone today can't currently write a marshaler that works with safe handles, or we'd be making it easier for them to do so purely because we'd be providing a template that they can copy and paste?
We would make it easier. It's actually, now with the design that we finalized on for .NET 7, we're able to write the marshalers. Like all of the features that are used here, a number of these features weren't used by any built-in marshalers in .NET 7, but we specifically added those features to be able to do this with safe handles in .NET 8.
Just to be clear, like I'm not pushing back, I'm trying to understand. The example you gave of someone writing their own custom marshaler, like they could achieve the exact same thing by putting up a sample that says, here, copy paste this code and edit it to your heart's content, right?
Yes, if we were to provide a sample that would match the existing logic that we have in the generator, that would also enable that scenario.
Yeah, I was gonna say the functionally someone can, but practically only Jeremy Korzynski could.
But does that get easier with this? I'm trying to understand how does adding this feature make it easier? Like, does that person end up writing less code?
It's possible. They could wrap. They could have their marshaler, if they're just trying to handle that null case, they could write their own marshaler types that basically wrap these ones and forward down all the calls except they check for null beforehand and then convert that to 0.
But what do they have to do? Do they have to literally take your generator, fork it, and basically have their own source generator, or would they just add attributes to their types?
So they would take this code from the BCL and modify it or wrap it, and then they put the attribute, the marshal using attribute, on either on their usages or the native marshaling attribute on the type, and then it would exclusively use their marshaler. It wouldn't use the built-in one anymore.
So you're saying what they would copy is effectively those structs that you're proposing here. They wouldn't have to fork the source generator. They would just have to fork those structs, tweak it to their need, and effectively point to those new types using the attributes.
Exactly.
But those structs aren't special. Like, whether those structs were built into the framework or not, they would still be copying the source. It's just where are they copying the source from?
Yeah, it makes it, by having it in the BCL, that makes it so that we also, as the interop team, don't have to own both the code in the generator and the samples, and like making sure we keep the samples up to date with any decisions that we make.
So one thing that sounds good, but a thing that actually bothers me from an engineering perspective is the generator going forward can still target down-level TFMs, which means you don't actually get to delete any of this code. It's just now the less tested code.
The down-level TFM support is only for .NET runtime, and for those cases, we could include these marshaler types.
So
in those down-level frameworks.
When you upgrade to .NET 8, if you have library imports, you can't say that you're publishing a NuGet package with a minimum TFM of .NET 7?
The generator ships with the ref pack, so if you publish with .NET 7, you get the .NET 7 version of library import generator, not the .NET 8 version. They publish along with the ref assemblies, so the generator itself is not supporting down level.
Okay.
Yeah, the down level support is only for simplification of support of using the generator in .NET runtime.
Okay. So you do, well, apparently you don't because we're special, but in the larger sense, you would be able to delete it because it's the generator is tied to the TFM you're generating for.
Yes, the same way the same process exists for the regex generator because it ships in the TFM, as well as like the system text JSON generator doesn't version with the TFM, but it versions with the system text JSON assembly, so it doesn't have to work with older versions of that assembly.
Okay. Because I was concerned if adding this was the idea of it makes the logic easier, but there's now this big untested or significantly less tested else, then that would actually concern me. But if it's not true, then I don't particularly care.
I mean, I don't have a huge objection. It just I don't have a huge objection. It feels a little strange that we're adding in this level of abstraction that makes in my opinion, the generated code harder to understand in support of, I mean, the benefit here is that it makes the generator simpler. The other benefits that were discussed, like it's sample code, it doesn't matter whether that sample code lives in the core libraries or lives on a doc or in the docs somewhere.
So, I mean,
the code you'd be delegating to, like you mentioned, delegating to these functions, but each of these is a one-liner in the implementation. So,
I will say the logic behind, in particular, the from unmanaged and to managed guaranteed is a little finicky, and especially the ref marshaller is a particularly finicky one because safe handles are weird, and they actually have a lot of annoyances in how it's implemented. In the generator, is the code to implement marshalling safe handles is significantly more complex, in my opinion, than the code to marshal using a custom marshaller in the generator.
I mean, isn't the real benefit the consistency that we have that custom marshallers are using those naming conventions and have structs in the framework?
Yeah, and there's also that of safe handles are the only type other than bools to not use marshallers that are built into the framework, and bools are just so dead simple that it's really questionable whether or not we would want to move to marshallers.
So my question is, why didn't this get proposed along with these changes in 7 then?
Because the initial design for custom marshallers did not support all of the cases needed to implement safe handle marshallers, in particular the generated unmarshalling, the guaranteed unmarshalling, and the uninvoked were not supported, and the ability to split depending on in, ref, or out for managed to unmanaged. Like the different marshallers per marshal mode were added very late in the process, and we did not have time to get this through API review and implemented in .NET 7. So we know you guys were very busy trying to get everything through, so we didn't want to add this if we knew we weren't going to have time to get it done.
So you're saying it looked like bools in the beginning, but once you added all the stuff, it was clear that it wasn't like bool, I guess.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was more so. It was more complex than everything else. And initially, we were saying, it's more complex. We don't want to deal with it. But when we went through the redesign, we built the design around being able to support it as one of the prime examples. And then we just looked at how much time we had left until the release, or until we cut off development, and we were like, we're not going to have time to get this in.
Okay, so when you designed the pattern, converting safe handle to using a custom marshaller was on your list. It just got cut because of calendar reasons.
Yeah, like we have a sample implementation of it when we were doing the design, but we didn't have time with API review and everything else to get it in. It would have possibly missed the RC1 cutoff, and then getting it in later at that point is not really doable.
I assume after the JIT gets done with it, this effectively evaporates and it's no more expensive than safe handle marshalling was before.
Yeah, and we'll have the better optimization of if the call fails, disposing the pre-allocated safe handles, which is very annoying to implement manually right now in the safe handle marshaller, because we'd have to very explicitly add support in various different places to do the right thing. Whereas in here, the uninvoked concept already gives us the right hook in the right place to add something custom for the safe handle scenario.
And that's the when something in the pinvoke system failed, as opposed to like the method returns failure.
Yeah, that would be like exception interop on Windows, or if marshalling the fourth argument failed, marshalling the fourth argument from managed to native failed before we made the call.
Okay. So definitely not as pervasive as the safe handle cleanup that Steve was doing previously, but fair enough. Yeah. I don't have any other feedback. It sounds like you're at shrug whatever, Steve.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to confirm, like this is a struct, but the T here is going to be a class. All the right JIT optimizations are still able to do everything they're supposed to do around generic specialization and all the like.
So, if I remember the surface area of safe handle correctly, none of the methods that we're calling are even virtual. So they're all on the base safe handle type anyway.
What methods are you calling? I thought you were calling methods like is invalid.
No, we're calling things like
dangerous add
dangerous add rep,
Oh,
dangerous
yeah,
release, and like a marshal.init handle.
I was gonna say there must be
those
some
are all,
magic
virtual.
thing you're calling to get around the fact that you're not supposed to be able to set handle. But
Yes, we introduced marshal.init handle in .NET 5 when we were first prototyping the marshallers for this particular scenario.
right, I mean generators wouldn't be able to do it at all if they couldn't already. Sadly, if we had added this before, we could have made it internal and not let there be a public method for it.
Yeah.
No, public methods is valid in its own right.
Yeah, it also makes it possible so that if people wanted to write their own marshals that had significantly different logic, they could still implement the concept of allocate the safe handle and then set it later.
Fair enough.
Which some of your code does, Jeremy.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
Other Jeremy. Jeremy B.
Yes, I was going to say that's definitely done in some of the crypto spaces.
Yeah. And probably other Jeremy does it too. Except I think most of his work is get rid of safe handle and just try to use int pointer directly. But
I was going to say, like, a lot of the cases where I've used it have been in that crypto space when Eleanor and I were doing crypto work for you guys.
all right, so sounds like that was all long-winded. Looks good as proposed.
There's nothing special about any of these names, right? Like you're just using the existing pattern, this is what it has to look like to work.
Yep, exactly.
Other than, I guess, the names of the structs themselves.
Right, but it sounds like the pattern we picked before, which was if it don't like name it after the marshal mode it's being used for. So. All the way down. When I push buttons, you should do things. Thank you, Jeremy.
Glad I could help.
How are we doing on time? Wow.
Half an hour left.
Add a delegate for on directory finished and others. 1953. It's a good year. I assume. I don't know. It feels romanticized in movies. Do we have anybody who knows what this is?
I mean, I guess my first question here would be why not follow a standard event pattern? But sure.
I feel like we hate events.
Doesn't even have to be an event pattern, but like instead of having get set properties that, you know, are of delegate types, like there is this event keyword that would work just fine. We don't even have to use object sender or whatever if we don't want to.
Well,
Right, because the difference between a property that returns a delegate and an event is, one, whether it's trivial to add and remove, because you can use plus equals rather than just assigning or doing, you know, delegate combine. And also C# guarantees that events it uses correct locking to ensure updates are correct rather than potentially tearing each other across threads.
Right.
my recollection
really get...
is we didn't like adding events and things that weren't really designed for UI. Like if we expected only one caller, that we weren't adding events anymore. We were only adding a get set property for a single delegate. It's only when we expect it to be hooked through pipelines and layering and that multiple things would probably be latching onto the same thing that we'd use event. I could be remembering wrong, but our rule is if you say event, you follow the event pattern, and if you don't need to be an event, don't be one, is what's in my head.
Sure.
I feel like every time someone said we don't need this to have multiple callbacks, there's been a scenario where we've ended up needing multiple callbacks. The most frustrating one currently is a DLL import.
I mean, there's nothing here that prevents multiple callbacks, right? You just do plus equals.
No, you can't do plus equals. You have to get the delegate. You have to combine the delegate with your new delegate. Then you have to set the delegate, and you have to consider that it's not going to use correct locking by default like event would. And so you have to consider tearing across threads.
Even if you don't have event, you can still do plus equals delegate, and the C# compiler will still generate for you delegate.combine, the existing thing, the new thing, and store it back. What you lose is the interlocked compare exchange loop.
Yeah. For this type, I'm not too worried about the interlocked, just because like this is clearly not a type meant for consumption by multiple callers. All of that said, like, you know, the reasons that we have things like object sender, blah blah blah, is so that you could hook up a single callback, and that single callback could handle a bunch of different enumerables that are taking place at the same time, because it gets, you know, this as a first parameter, rather than you having to capture that and then, you know, flow to some common helper method.
I mean, it kind of depends on the definition of the delegate type, right?
What do you mean?
I mean, the delegate signature, like, we control, right? So just because you use a delegate, I mean, you don't have to use the full event handler with object sender and event arcs, right? But you can totally have a delegate that takes whatever you want as the first argument, right? So if you really want to pass back the object that this event is for, like, we could still do that, right?
Oh yeah, and I mean that's typical of a like UI pattern, right? Where you have some single method on your, you know, WinForms application, like within the class there, that just says like, well, I don't know what enumerable I was hooked up to, but I'll just look at the sender and take a look from there. Granted, that might not be terribly useful here because the sender doesn't really give you any interesting information, because you can't go back from the enumerable to like whatever initiated it.
Right.
The more interesting thing, I think, with and something that's strange with events and multiple things hooked up is the return value. So like the continue on error predicate returning bool is strange in an event.
Well, it's also strange when you have multiple delegates combined, because which one wins?
Right. What I meant was an API that's intended to just be set to one thing, and that's sort of not actively encouraging the use of multicast, might lead to a bit of success better, but not. I mean, like you say, you can do it regardless, and the invoker could make up some, could use get the list of all registered delegates and combine the Boolean results or however it wanted to. It's just weird.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why the Control-C handler in its event args has a mutable should we let the process finish exiting or not. And if you set it to don't exit, then whatever the last person does really wins, but most people are only going to be moving it one way or the other. And
So the other consideration for delegate versus event, and I'm not sure if this is important, is that an event will not allow an external person to invoke it.
Right.
If you expose a property, then anyone can do file system enumerable dot should continue on error predicate dot invoke and invoke that delegate.
It's not just invoke, right? You also get to walk the list. You can remove arbitrary things, right? With events, you can only really add or give an entry. You can't walk it.
Right, but in this case, you're like file system enumerable of t result isn't really a thing you're passing around.
Yeah, I agree. It's a low-level type, right? I mean, it's the fast file system enumeration to begin with. So, I mean, if we had single cast delegates, we would probably use them, right? But we don't have them, so we basically just use the good old multicast delegate everywhere. I mean, I would just follow the pattern that the type already has for the two predicates. So in that sense, the proposal, I guess, is consistent with what we have. But I don't think the proposal actually talks about what the delegate itself looks like, right? It just has the... Oh, no, it does, actually. It's in... I see it's inline.
Right, all right.
Yeah. I mean, neither of these delegates should be new delegate types. Oh, wait, this one actually has to be. But the... this should just be func event to bool.
I really don't like using func and action and all of that everywhere because, parameter names mean something. All of that said, I don't think this should be returning bool. I think this should be returning an enum, where the enum values are continue or abort. Because the delegate shape itself, just returning a bool, okay, what does the bool mean? You need some external information, such as the name of the property, to understand what the delegate's return value actually meant. Where if you're returning an enum value, continue or abort, that enum value, you can look at the return value and say, I know what you meant. I don't need to go look up whatever property name you happen to come from. It's fully self-contained.
It's fair. I wonder if we happen to already have one. Because the current...
Isn't the shape of the delegate itself also indicative that true is the only one that makes sense here?
You have a bool returning method. What do you do with a bool?
I mean, it's called continue on error. Given the error, should I continue?
No,
false is don't. And
what is called that?
It's probably, as he showed here, a lambda. So.
Yeah. I guess that's what I'm getting at. The function itself that you're writing is just going to be some helper method, probably not even with a name. So what does it mean to return true or false? You need to correlate that with some external information.
It says it literally right there. Continue.
Yeah.
No, that's not the delegate itself though. The delegate is everything after the equal sign.
Yes, but there's everything that you need to know is on the screen.
Assuming that you're writing exactly this pattern.
Right, when you move into, if you make, should continue on error predicate equal error code helper, semicolon, then yes, error code helper was a bad name for your method because you've lost what true and false means. But if you call it, continue on error handler, then it's still back to what, the method name implies what true means, which is continue.
I guess the thing I'm running into is I don't like the idea of like having to match two different things together in order to like figure out what a true and false return value mean. Like it also means that we can never, you know, add anything else in the future if we care. I don't know if we ever would.
I mean, I think that's a fair argument, but I think like the argument that you need some external information to determine what true or false means, I mean, that's true for any method returning true or false, right?
Often the method name actually tells you what it means.
And in this case,
Yep.
from the purpose of an invoker, the method name is should continue. If you choose to bind that to a thing with a bad name, that's on you.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? I mean, like either you use a lambda, in which case we provide the name, which I would argue is a good name for this, and if you name it yourself, well, then that's on whoever defines the method to give it a good name, right? So I think that seems fine.
Okay.
I think the question really is like, you know, do we need anything else? I mean, like for error, you could also imagine a case where it just literally throws an exception, right?
Maybe I think, I guess, yeah. I don't know what false means. I assume it's throw, but maybe it's skip. And if it's continue, skip, or throw, then now
Yeah,
we're
I think that's
try
probably
again.
the biggest argument for an enum, right? Because I mean, you have these three cases logically, right? And I think continue is well defined, but the non-continue case at least has two options.
I agree. Skip and throw being two possible interpretations of false.
Well, I guess.
I guess continue means skip, because continue can't, like, you can't, it failed, you can't do anything else.
Right.
If it succeeded, we didn't, nothing invoked the thing. So this is, I'm in the fail path. Do you want fail with exception or fail with ignore?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So now we're back to 2. It is unambiguous once we, think.
Yeah, and it's probably hard to imagine a case where you would do something different, right? Because you either throw or you eat it, right? There really is not nothing else to do.
Right, because is the walk going to continue? And assuming it's a directory, it can't dive into it. The only interpretation of that is skip.
Right. So I think I don't quite know what the on directory finished action, like what does it allow you to do?
The enumeration is complete. Oh, no. The enumeration of a given subdirectory is complete.
Yeah, I think this is like if you're writing the dir command of I finished walking a directory, so now I can tell you here's the total file count and here's the total size of this directory.
Oh, I see. You could have a running total that that every time a directory is finished, you reset it or something, or push it on a stack or something. Yeah.
Yeah, but if it doesn't tell you that it's pushed a new directory, I guess you get that implicitly of we finished a directory, so the next call must be a new one. Yeah, that works. You would just reset your state.
This assumes breadth first. It would have to, I guess.
Yeah, I guess
yeah, that it does require that you're assuming a particular ordering.
I mean, isn't the counterpart for on directory finish basically should recurse? Because clearly we call that before we recurse, right? But you don't know the directory, I guess. So, no, I guess you have to, right? Because I guess the find predicate gives you the thing that it's trying to. It gives you the entry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, you could figure out whether it was depth or breadth by the order that it asked the predicate questions.
Which I also think we can't really change, right? So I guess assuming that seems fine. Or hard coding it or manifesting it seems fine.
Could it? Could it not?
I mean, isn't the whole point that the file system entry? So I guess so it's a struct, right? So presumably, I think every time you go to a new directory, we reuse the underlying resources, right? So you can't. So I guess that's why there can only be one thing active at any given point in time, right? Which I think means that you can't really change the way you traverse, which kind of has to be depth first, I guess.
Guess. Yeah, I'm just trying to picture it in my head. Finding
Yeah,
how where they call it is getting hard. Because they give you the whole entry, so you would certainly be able to tell if it's depth or breadth, but since they're not just asking like, hey, given this name, should I walk into it? They're giving you a full structure thing.
Right.
I believe they would say you shouldn't be assuming and ordering, and we can change it anytime we want, but I don't know.
I also don't think we can give you the entry on directory finish action because we already point to the next entry, I think. Isn't that one of the things?
If we should recur, then enqueue it, and then presumably somewhere we dequeue, and so it may or may not have the data, because it threw it away when it queued it.
I think if we had the data, it probably would be nicer to actually give you the entry as well, rather than giving you the read-only span of char. But if we don't have it, then I guess that's the best you can do. Although I don't know where the directory name comes from. Clearly somebody had to buffer that as well then.
Yeah, well, there's some discussion within the issue about whether like to use spans or file system entries or whatever. But I'm looking at the implementation, and in the implementation, we always have a file system entry.
Well, in that
like
case,
we create them just left and right.
Then I think I would probably change the signature to just give you this file system entry as well.
Because they definitely get a directory handle. I assume that can be turned into a file system entry with low cost.
Well, remember, when you call should include or should recurse, like you have a file system entry at that point, it's required to be passed into the find predicate as a parameter.
Right, but again, looking at the implementation, when they call should recurse, they turned it into a thing so they could pass it to you, and then they extract the path, like the string of the path out of that, throw the structure away, and just put the string into a queue. And then later they dequeue the string and open a directory handle again. So it could have even been deleted and you're grabbing a different directory by the time you actually get around to recurring it.
Can someone remind me, like, why do we pass this in by ref? Is it because the entry itself is mutable and lazy or something?
Oh, it is.
That sounds right.
Great. Yes, it's a struct.
Yeah. So the idea is not really that somebody assigns to it. The idea is more that if you mutate it, you want to observe it on the other side. Odd, but okay. I guess.
Okay, and the directory comes through there as a read-only span of char. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is weird because they have it as a string.
Yeah.
I guess it's also unclear from this, is the directory supposed to be the full path or the friendly, like the local name, or the... It does seem much saner that if they want to do this, it should just be the full file system entry.
Yeah, and we should probably rename the delegate to something else at that point.
I think the idea is because there was... What was it? Maybe it would just be too expensive to reacquire all of that, like the attributes, creation time, stuff like that.
Maybe, but... And if that's the case, it's fine, but it seems like they could still make it be action of string instead of effectively action of Rosh char. Like, they have a string, unless the idea is they think they're going to be able to get rid of the string at some point.
Do they actually have a string?
private string question mark current path. Every time they dequeue something from their queue, like current path gets assigned from the queue. So they're entirely working with strings. There are no Ross chars here.
It might just be an implementation detail, though, not exposed through the public API surface.
I mean, you can't queue a read-only span of char.
No, but you could
Meaningfully.
you could queue a shared buffer that keeps mutating under the covers.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I suppose they kind of have the full path as they're traversing, right? So I guess when you're done with a directory, you could just say whatever the local variable is that has your path, you can just pass that in effectively, right? Because that's killing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also looking at the Unix implementation. The Windows one might not have strings, so.
I guess.
Yeah, because I don't want them to be forced to expose an implementation detail if it's not already forced by the public API surface.
Most of our path stuff uses strings.
Most, but I remember this being like one of the group that was specifically crafted to be like low allocation. So strings are not really used, at least in the public API surface.
How do you build one of these things?
I mean, you could imagine effectively a buffer, right, that you allocate once, right, and then just mutate, right, which would be difficult with strings.
Yeah. Okay, so all of that said then, like if we don't want to use an event pattern, and we don't want to require ref file system entry, and we don't want to force people to return an enum instead of a bool, then I don't really have any complaints with this API shape. It seems, straightforward once we got all of that out of the way.
Well, our guidelines say that essentially, if func or action will compile and is not ambiguous, don't define your own delegate. So continue on error predicate should go away.
And does it become func of int bool or predicate of int? Do we even use predicate of t anywhere?
I don't think we use predicate. We should, because it's so
Okay.
beautifully named, but I think we use func of int bool.
Yeah, Link uses func bool everywhere.
One day, the runtime team will decide that they're going to do delegate identity, and then it'll be the same type. But until then,
Dot invoke. It's great.
until then they won't.
Yeah.
So you're basically suggesting we remove continue on error predicate, but then we keep on directory finish delegate?
So it depends on if we keep it as Ross char or change it to string. The constructor of this type here, the thing that they're passing in as directory, that is typed as string. So you have to start with a string. The
Right.
Unix implementation certainly has string of the full path of everything it's going to potentially enumerate. So the Unix implementation has the string. It's the better type. We have the return the richest type you have and be honest about it. So that suggests string is the better answer here. If we think that there really is a chance that they're going to use a reused buffer of some sort with their own notion of a memory manager of when the queue gets too full and they ran out of buffer and they want to deal with all that complexity and they're doing that instead of string, then I guess by taking Ross char we've made things easier, but I think really taking Ross char here is just going to make the API not usable. And that even if the Windows implementation or the Mac implementation has a awesome, I don't need to ever manifest strings, it's if you registered this and you have a non-null delegate here, it's going to toString it. Like that makes it pay for play.
Yeah, basically, but you would want to do this only when the delegate is assigned, right?
Yeah, if
Which you could easily detect.
If they would have to manifest it, they would say if one's there, then do thingy.toString, and that would be whether that's in common code and I guess it wouldn't matter. It couldn't be in common code. The Unix one definitely, what they're passing in is a string. Or what they would be passing in is a string. If some other OS implementation has it actually only as a read-only span of char, then it would manifest a string out of that. But it would only do it if it was invoking the delegate. So I think we should replace it with action of string.
I guess that would break if people were using null object patterns, but I don't think that tends to be all that common here.
So why would that break that?
It would, because you don't know if the delegate that you're about to invoke is a null pattern. You would pessimistically have to hydrate the string every single call.
Oh, you basically mean a delegate that does nothing, like a no-op
Right.
delegate?
Yeah, a no-op delegate. As opposed to a delegate whose reference is null.
Yeah, I guess we would tell those people, like, turns out that abstractions cost you.
Yeah.
I mean, the other question is, like, I don't know, what does file system enumer would do when you assign to the properties while you're enumerating? I assume they blow up.
Assigning while enumerating should be fine.
Well, it just
I mean-
means that the expectation for, assigning the on-directory finished action very late, like, does that mean that we accidentally didn't initialize the path that we passed to the API, or so do you actually accidentally get null? I guess it depends on when the allocation happens.
I think they invoke it late, so they let it be replaced.
Yeah.
Like they don't have
That case,
anything
it's
they don't have anything that says it would break out of it. Like they don't have oh my god, I've already started enumerating fail. And everything seems to be a class, so when they wrap it with a secondary type to handle the nulls for them, they don't
Copy.
yeah, it's not a copy, it's a forward pointer.
Yeah. That's probably fine.
So, again, like I think we do need to probably speak with the area owners and make sure that, like, hey, are you doing breadth or depth first, and is this on directory finished API actually appropriate? Because if you're doing depth first, then you need an on directory started.
Yeah, I think the on directory started should recurse effectively, right?
Well, looking at the again the Unix implementation, here, I'll just drag this window over.
I mean, should recurse to me doesn't say this is happening now. It just says it might happen at some indeterminate point in the future, and it might happen at some indeterminate point.
So should recurse.
I guess that's
should
it.
recurse.
I would just naively think that call should recurse right before they actually recurse.
No, so it's while walking through a directory, if the entry they found is a directory, then they call should recurse, and if you return true, they enqueue it.
Yeah.
And
So
then they're going to keep draining their current
yeah.
state. So this is a breadth first. The Unix implementation, because that's
Yep.
what got indexed, is breadth first.
And we would be saying they can never ever change the implementation ever. It is locked for all time, because otherwise these APIs would break.
Well, it's already broken, no? Because by the time, basically, because it basically means right now you don't have a way to reset any counters because there is no on started, right? So if you do it in should recurse, then you do it too soon.
I mean, we can
Well, I guess your
just-
transform API knows
we can
when
just
the
add-
directory starts.
on directory started.
I think that's what we should do, yeah. Because if it's already breadth first, then I don't know how you get to the behavior where you can just use should recurse.
Your the other two APIs, the ones that take the ref file system entry, presumably you can look at the file names in there and figure out what directory you're currently in.
Because, yeah, when you've seen a new entry of however it is that it returns the entries back, maybe from that you could figure out what directory you've clearly started. Otherwise, you're basically just local accumulating and then like, oh, thank you for telling me what directory we were in at the finish.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can add the
But I
start
mean,
for symmetry.
yeah. Yeah, we should probably add the star, because otherwise now you have to keep track of what the previous directory was, which means like you now have multiple pieces of data to juggle, which is just painful. Because the directory could also be empty, which means you never would have seen it, aside from, I guess, the one finished call.
What would that
Sure.
mean? Root of the drive?
Sorry?
So what does an empty directory mean?
Maybe you care that the directory exists, even though there's no enumerated elements within it. So you would get started, then completed with no items.
Gotcha. You mean empty as in the directory doesn't contain any files, not that the path itself is the empty string.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Correct.
That makes sense.
Okay, so the existing delegates were called find predicate and find transform, and then the properties were called should recurse predicate and should include predicate. But otherwise, I just wonder, like, should we, yoink and just call it on directory finished? But I think that'll make the type look weird. But because
then we would call it on.
Well, right. So I don't know that this should be on. I think we should get rid of the ons.
Yeah.
And then because our event naming guidelines for this would be that it would be called directory starting, or directory started if we want, because there's a question of have you already done work or not. But like it feels like what we would have is directory starting and directory finished, and get rid of the ons and the actions. But the type as it exists, the good names went to the delegates, and so the properties got bad names.
Yeah. That seems okay.
So using bad names is consistent with the type. But yeah. It's a question of those two, or even those two. But I think we can get rid of the ons no matter what.
Are you sure about starting? Like, I thought INGs are not really the normal naming convention for that.
ING means before and ED means after.
Right. If you consider that you're kind of sandwiching the directory operation, then I would probably say starting and finished.
Yeah.
I guess. I thought for most events we don't have an ING. It's like on mouse move and then also on mouse moved.
It's pretty common in ASP.NET, not really common in the rest of and also WinForms, like click handling, click handled.
Because you would have for the mouse, what does it mean the mouse is about to start moving? Like you received an event from the mouse that said I moved. Like you can't ask it to tell you before it starts moving. But yes, for something like a button, you could have clicking, which you could, for example, return false from to say don't show the button down state. We're not going to allow them to transition into it. Clicked is they've already pushed down and let off. So the ing is they're trying to do a thing, but it hasn't happened yet, and the ed is this is done.
Yeah, like the operating system, ing gives you the chance to block the operating system from handling whatever they're doing, and ed says the operating system handled it, you're just doing some post action.
But in this case, there's no way that you can block it, so ing and ed are going to be the same at the start. But I do feel like starting and finished is more appropriate to the actions that are happening.
Yeah, that feels like a more proper sandwich to me, ing and ed.
So then the question is, do we want to leave the action suffixes on to match the existing predicate suffixes that are on?
I think that's okay to have the action suffix,
Okay.
especially since we have, other properties. We have existing properties that have predicate, and we're probably about to introduce a new one that says predicate. I still think we're going to get smacked for doing string instead of rajchar.
I mean, in the Unix implementation, they already have the string. String is the better usable type and is more consistent with the file system APIs. To me, everything
Yeah, I
says
think-
string is better.
I think the one thing you need to, make sure is that if you don't have the handler registered on the Windows side, that we don't just blindly allocate now for a directory where we have 250,000 things in them, and then we end up accidentally allocating 250,000 strings.
Yeah, but that's fine. It gives them something to fix in V9, and then Steve can write it in his blog post.
Sure, famous last words, but yeah.
Right. So then I think for the continue on error, they called the predicate continue on error predicate, and then the property, then they added should as a prefix, and I think we can get rid of the should.
Yeah, so another question about this.
Unless we think that the should helps answer the Boolean question. But
do you need the name of the entry that was an error? Like, how do you know where the error occurred, or do you not care?
And we can bounce that back to them and then say that a custom delegate is warranted once it's telling you the path and the int code, and not making you just figure out that an int is an error code and a string is a path. But
yeah, because I guess like
or we add
what I'm
string int bool.
Yeah, what I'm trying to figure out is like is the error that you asked me to open a directory but I couldn't open the directory, so like you want me to just skip recursing the files within it? At that point, like, we need to give you the directory name, presumably. But who knows?
Maybe. Yeah.
Because I don't see how we would fail to get individual files within the directory, because we're not opening the files, we're just enumerating them.
Because what I don't understand is this
Yeah,
thing's enumerable over T, and if that T can be a file system entry, then theoretically we could have failed to open that, but I don't know if that's we give back an entry that says it's in an invalid state, or we throw, and so I don't know if this is only on directory open or if it's also on file analysis. But
so I think the reason it's T is because within your own enumerable you can have a transform that's returning a cacheable entry object.
Fair enough.
So if you return a file system info every time, like file system info basically is a standalone class, which I think most people would use, but maybe you have, my custom cacheable file system info, and you just keep mutating it every single time because, allocations are evil or something. It's an advanced API.
Yeah, but I think honestly, for the error one, I think you want some information about what entry that was, right? Because even at the very minimum, if you do something like draw some UI, you want to at least know which one do I paint in red, right?
Right, exactly. And because I don't necessarily know the failure states, I don't know if the error path would be a directory, if it would be a specific file within the directory, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, especially like the sample code they have on screen where it's like log the error. Logging to the very minimum tell you which directory it was.
Yes.
Yes.
I got access denied. Cool. Doing what?
Yeah. And it's also possible that we won't actually have a file system entry at this point, because like maybe we can't even get the attributes on the directory. So literally all we can give you is a string. Sorry, that's it.
Yeah, that's fair, I guess. So, but like I would say, it strikes me as there should probably be symmetric to the on directory finished and on directory started in terms of what they accept.
Okay. So strings then, presumably.
Yeah, I mean either strings or a span. I think I can live with the span because this is not a great API, and I think, but I think even if you give people a span, can't they just toString the span if they really want to string? They can, right?
Yeah, I would hope that this API is not called all that often, so it would be okay to take a string because it is kind of an error case, and we can defer hydrating it until needed.
Yeah, my point is that if the caller can do it, or if the callee can do it, then that's also fine, right?
Yeah, I mean, they may also say that what they want to do is manifest this more complicatedly, because this could be that they have my current directory as a string, but the file system entry I actually only have as a block of memory I gave to the OS, and they wrote the name here, and I haven't manifested a string for the full entry yet. But I don't know how all of that works. So.
So what you're really saying is you want to pass in an exception object.
Know what it would should look like. String it bool. I can have the whole window in the screen. Alright, so I think we bounce it back as this is as far as we got in...
Yeah. Who is the owner for this, by the way?
it's marked as assigned to David.
Gotcha.
We talked about it. We didn't have a decision. Okay. I think that's as far as we're going to make it.
Awesome.
I'll flip these around and put bold. Okay. Needs work. All right. So, we're not really tracking volume here, but there's certainly a lot of things. So, yeah. But that's a lot of stuff for one of these meetings. So, I actually feel good about what we got through today.
Great.
So, cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. For anybody who watched this live or watches this late or whatever, and see you all next week, same .NET time on the same .NET channel. Apparently, that's my closing line now.
Excellent.
Oh, and this thing.
And like, subscribe.
Subscribe and push the bell or ring the bell, whatever. I don't know. YouTube's silly. Bye.